is Chapter 4, Defining the Research, and today we'll talk about establishing our question, title, purpose, hypothesis, and definitions for our research paper. And before you begin the lecture, it would be best if you would pull out the article that we used in Lecture 2, Unit 1, because we're going to use it as an example in a few places. And then also, if you can pull out, if you go under Unit 3, Research Part 6, and look at the assignment, there is an example of what you're going to do for that. And if you'll pull that out, because we may also use that today to kind of help with examples to explain the different parts that we're going to talk about. So first we're going to look at problem or question development. And the purpose of a research study is to answer a question, problem, or hypothesis that will solve a problem. And your question is a very important step because your question needs to be meaningful. It needs to be something that can be studied, so it has to be a reasonable question. And the more precise the question, the easier it will be to answer. And question development can come from research ideas, can come from lectures, it can come from personal interest, or it can also come from searching research literature of key terms, which you will be doing, that you did on your library assignment. And a lot of times your question will somehow relate to the 5 P's of retelling, so you'll look at some aspect of that. And an example of a well-defined question would be, does the theory of planned behavior predict online purchase intentions of Generation Y consumers? So in that question or problem development, you have mentioned your key terms and what do you want to find out and learn. Next, we'll look at the title. And the title identifies the types of questions and components of the research, and it helps to identify conceptual and operational definitions. The title also reflects what the researcher is investigating or reporting about. It also reflects your key terms or concepts. And as we mentioned before, those key terms should be mentioned in your title, which we learned when we did the FRAP. And you also want your title to be short and concise. So you just need to be short and concise. I think I mentioned it doesn't need to be over, 9 to 11 words. And titles are often the first clue in finding your sources when you're investigating your research topic. So that's how, when you do a research search, that's how they look. They go off the title in the abstract to pull up the terms that you've typed in that you're looking for. So an example of another title that would be a good title because it's short and concise is Adolescent Females' Choice of Gene Fabrication Related to Peer Pressure. Key terms are words or phrases that are used in your title, your purpose, and your hypothesis. And they're a starting point for your investigation when you start to look for your literature review. Also, key terms include words that identify the sample and variables that are going to be examined. So in that last example that we looked at, it was adolescent females, which is our sample, and then what's going to be examined. It was going to look at peer pressure and how that affects the choice of gene fabrication that they buy. Also, key terms identify results or conditions in the study, and they establish a start for reviewing literature related to those topics. So that's why we have chose our key terms so we can start doing our literature review. And so our key terms in the example that we just looked at would be adolescent females, gene fabrication, and peer pressure and how that affects choice of fabrication. Next is the purpose. And the purpose lets the reader know why the investigation takes place and why an author chose to study particular variables. And it's a statement of the objectives of the study, and it should be well defined and specific. It also gives the general guidelines and direction that the study will take. and the key terms are usually included in your purpose. So going off in our example that we just looked at, the purpose is to investigate peer pressure related to the selection of genes by adolescent females. Next is developing a hypothesis. And for your study, as I mentioned, you'll either do a hypothesis or a research question. We'll talk about both. So looking at a hypothesis, it's an educated guess or hunch to what will be found by the research study. And it's used mostly in quantitative studies. And it looks at the nature of two or more variables or a phenomenon. So you're going to have an independent and a dependent variable. And sometimes you can have more than one independent variable. And you can either have a null hypothesis or just a general hypothesis, a positive hypothesis. And a null hypothesis is when you think you'll get a negative result. So an example would be, my null hypothesis would be, if we took a quiz right now over Chapter 4, the students would not do well since the material has not been covered. So the null does not assume that there will be a positive outcome. And when writing the hypothesis, it's important that the researcher includes the variables that will be investigated and the expected outcomes. Variables can vary, so it's important to be specific when including them. So if we look at our example, the hypothesis says adolescent females will wear similar fabrications of jeans due to peer pressure. So what they included is they included fabrication, so you'll know exactly what they're talking about. So they included fabrication will include blue jeans, color dyed jeans, stonewash jeans, and acid wash jeans. So that's where you're going to include exactly what variables are going to be studied. Next is using a research question. And research questions are commonly used in qualitative research, but they can also be used in quantitative research and for our types of studies. And they often ask who or why. So you want to ask who or why about a question, and it brings out many different answers. And researchers use both questions and hypotheses to answer problems. So an example of a research question: does the theory of planned behavior predict online purchase intentions for apparel? Next is definitions. And within your key terms, you're going to want to define these terms. And definitions are the meanings or the explanation of a word. And if you look at the link and web address that I gave you, this is a site that gives you APA citation for definitions, which you're going to need to do for this unit. So I would definitely use that as a resource. And definitions need to be short, clear, and concise. And you don't want to include the word or its base in the definition. Also, you need to use definitions to describe what it is and not what it is not. Your definitions need to explain and narrow your key terms, and they may need specific clarity, and you may need to describe what it is. So we've kind of mentioned that before. If you need to describe something or give the meaning to something, because remember we talked about dress as a definition and how it has 3 different types of meanings, so that's why you need to be clear about the meaning of your definition. Definitions also describe and explain what the researcher is studying, and they denote how a variable is to be measured, and they bridge the gap between the hypothetical and empirical reality. They translate constructs into empirical terms, and they enable the researcher to point to things in the observable world that are being studied, and they also specify activities or operations involved in measuring or manipulating variables. So looking at organizing your definitions, you want similar and subsets of terms grouped together, and they should be as close as possible to common usage of what other people usually use it for. You will use, for certain definitions, if it is a concept, then you'll need just a conceptual definition. If not, if it's construct, you'll need both a conceptual and operational definition. And you'll need to use a source and document it in APA. So you'll need a little citation after it if you pulled it from somewhere else. So I mentioned that word construct and concept. A construct is never observable. So for example, you cannot view someone's self-esteem. So constructs are building blocks to get to a final concept, such as a model. And constructs are a type of concept that exists at a higher level of abstraction, and it's usually something built or put together systematically. So as I mentioned, it's kind of like a theory usually is behind constructs. They work together to explain a phenomenon. An example using constructs would be our example that we looked at on Unit 1, Lecture 2, where we looked at the article on innovation and internet and purchases through the internet. And the innovation decision process, that would be a construct because it's not observable. But then what they did is they used that innovation theory by Rogers, and it was a theory that used 5 perceived attributes to determine someone's innovation decision process, while concepts are observable. So an example of a concept would be genes. You can explain the meaning of it, how it's used. You can provide a picture with it along with a working definition. And a concept explains the meaning of the word and how it is used in research. And some more examples of a construct. An example of a construct besides we mentioned self-esteem, some more would be intelligence, satisfaction, work ethic. They're all constructs at a higher level of abstraction. So you can't just say someone has a 90% work ethic because it's something that's psychological and you can't actually physically see that. So we also mentioned construct and concept. Within that, we mentioned conceptual and operational definitions. And you're also going to have to do this for your assignment in this unit. So looking at conceptual definitions, and what they are is what other researchers have been using as the definition of a concept. So it allows you to test the theory that you want to test, and it's not circular. So it does not say, an example would be of how it's not circular is if you say, when you're say support for democracy is when the public voices support for democratic values. So remember how I kind of mentioned you can't use the word in the actual definition? That's kind of this whole circular thing. Also, a conceptual definition of a variable states precisely what you mean when you use a particular term. So remember example dress. Dress can mean an article of clothing worn by women. It can mean one's appearance, or it can mean to put on an article of clothing. So that's why we need a conceptual definition for our terms so we know exactly what you're testing and what you're looking at. So a conceptual definition helps terms from being confusing. And a conceptual definition can describe a model, a construct, or a theory. And remember, our constructs are not observable. So a construct will have a conceptual definition, but a construct will also have an operational definition. And it is a definition that translates a construct into empirical terms and defines it. So it is a recipe that will be used for going into the world and measuring the variable. And it helps us make the leap from our subjective impressions to an objective measure. It also describes and explains how the word will be used in the research and what the researcher is studying. So with an operational definition, You want to define what to do and what to observe in order to make the phenomenon under study perceivable and understandable. So remember our example that we said that that we talked about looking at, and we'll look at the model in just a little bit of purchase intentions. Purchase intentions, there's 3 variables that come into play that, or constructs that come into play that determine purchase intentions. And that is your attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. And so that's what you would talk about in your operational definition. You would first say what purchase intentions are, which we know is a construct because it's not observable. And then you would say in your operational definition, to determine purchase behavior, you must look at attitudes, perceived behavioral control, and subjective norm of a consumer to determine their purchase intentions. So it kind of gives you the process that you're going to use for that. So another very simple example of an operational definition, which is kind of like a recipe, is it tells you definition for a peanut butter sandwich might be the results of putting peanut butter on a slice of bread with a butter knife and laying a second equally sized slice of bread on top. So that was our definition. You could also, another type of definition that's kind of like a simple recipe would be to make pizza, you need dough, then you make it into a big circle, you add marinara sauce, cheese, and pepperonis, and this would be your definition for a pizza. But if you added to your definition that you fold it over and you add another step, it turns it into a calzone. So that's why it's important in operational definitions to explain everything that you're going to do, because of one little change in it can make it totally different. Okay, so here is an example of our operational and conceptual definitions. So I mentioned about behavior. Behavior is how an individual responds to a buying situation. For this study, behavior is measured by looking at an individual's perceived control, subjective norm, and attitudinal behavior about purchasing apparel online and how that affects their behavior. So see how we took behavior and we said that purchase behavior is something that's not observable, and then we listed the steps of how we were going to determine behavior. Here's just another example of stating how when you have a construct, you're going to need a operational definition and a conceptual definition. So an example would be if you looked at depression is a state of excessive sadness or hopelessness, often with physical symptoms. So that would be your conceptual definition. Then you would want to state as your operational definition that depression was measured using Beck's Depression Inventory. And then within that, you may also want to mention who the target population is in your operational definition. So it could be looking at depression among adolescent girls aged 13 to 18 is how you would say using the Beck's Depression Inventory model to determine depression among adolescent girls ages 13 to 18 would be your operational definition. And as I mentioned, a lot of your operational definitions will be taking different constructs to form a model. So you may use a model for your study. If so, you'll use one that's already been developed. But you don't necessarily have to use a model for your study. But if you were doing academic research at the collegiate level in grad school or as a professor, you would need a model for almost any problem that you try to answer, because you'll have to have a theory behind it, and within the theory there's usually a model to explain your theory in the different constructs. So in this example, all this model is showing is the connections between the constructs. So it's saying how A connects to construct D, A to B connects to construct D, and then construct C connects to construct D. And all standardized scales and models break concepts into multiple subparts that are summed up to construct the scale, and they're used to describe a single concept. So kind of like I've mentioned of the theory of planned behavior, which we'll look at next, or the model theory of the theory of planned behavior, you're going to use, it's going to be broken down into different concepts that are used, or constructs, to describe a final or single concept. And there's meaningful links believed to exist between each of these constructs. So looking at the model of the theory of planned behavior, I mentioned before that it looks at intention and purchase behavior, and it uses behavior attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, and how that affects intentions, which after that affects behavior. So the constructs for this theory are behavioral attitudes, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. And these are constructs because they're not observable. But if we were looking at the purchase of something from the internet, and if we looked at apparel, our apparel would be our concept for our theory. If we look at this chart, all the terms on the far left, achievement, self-control, clothing uses, these are either concepts, constructs, or theories, and by testing them, they become observable through a test and or an operational definition. So example, if we want to look at academic achievement, you would use the SAT to determine academic achievement. So an actual concept or theories with SAT are tested by this actual test. And then if you want to look at self-concept, you could use the multi-dimensional self-concept scale to determine someone's self-concept. So you would either use, this is using a scale, this is using a test. Let's see, there's also using the 4-factor index of social status, which would probably be a theory. And then we just mentioned before, you can look at purchase to intentions and behavior using the theory of planned behavior. Looking at measures, other tests of a concept, a construct, or a theory can be found by studying the literature using key terms. And some different sources that are used to look for different measures or scales that can be used, or theories that can be used within certain key terms. You can look at the Handbook of Marketing Scales, or measures of social psychological attitudes. And a lot of times, if you look at research articles, they'll also have scales within them that have been used that you could use, especially if they list their survey questions. That's always a really great one to use, because then those questions have already been proved as reliable and valid. So these are just some other sources that you can find, that you can use to find tests for concepts and constructs and theories. And this concludes lecture 4.